All right, fifth graders, we're going to go ahead and tackle our last operation with decimals, dividing decimals by decimals. And I'd say this is probably the most difficult of all of the operations. And here's why. Because it's pretty challenging to figure out how many times decimal numbers fit into other numbers, because what we're going to start doing is we're going to divide by decimals. We're going to have those decimals be the divisors. So we're going to be trying to figure out, how many times, let's say 3/10 fits into 9, and things like that, which is not so easy for our brains. Oh. Our brains are really good with whole numbers. So there's actually a really neat thing that we can do. We can actually, I'm going to say, quote unquote, turn our decimals into whole numbers. And mathematically, what we're doing is we're multiplying by a power of 10 to do so. So to make dividing by decimals easier, we want to turn our divisor, the number we're dividing by, into a whole number, because our brains are so much better at thinking about how many times, let's say 3 whole things goes into another number versus 3/10. So for instance, if I was dividing by 3/10, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply by a power of 10. In this case, we're going to multiply by 10. That shifts the decimal once and turns it into the number 3. Now, in math, we have to be super fair and equal. So if we're going to be changing the divisor, then we're going to need to also multiply the dividend by that same power of 10. So the number that I'm splitting up, I will also have to multiply, in this case, by 10, because what you do to the divisor, you have to also do to the dividend. So here's the shortcut, and I know this is very wordy, and we'll get to some examples that I think will make more sense. The shortcut is to simply shift the decimal to the right as many times as needed until your decimal divisor is now a whole number. Okay, so maybe you shift it twice, maybe 3 times, maybe once. You are going to shift the decimal the same number of times in your dividend as well. So what you do to the outside, you also have to do to the inside. So this might require us to annex or add a decimal and zeros in the dividend so that we can shift the decimal that same amount of times as we did in the divisor. We might have to, we might not have to. And then we're going to divide normally, like we normally would. If now that the divisor is a whole number, we're just going to go ahead and tackle with long division. Remember to bring the decimal straight up into the quotient or your answer. So let's do an example together. I am dividing 2.5 by 25 hundredths. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up for long division. So I have 2.5. The first number, remember, is my dividend. The second number is the divisor. Okay, so I'm going to take my dividend and I'm dividing it by the divisor. Now this one actually is not too tough, because if we think about 25 hundredths as a quarter, it's not too bad to think about how many times a quarter fits into 2 whole things, but it gets a little messier when we're trying to figure out how many times a quarter fits into 5/10 of a thing. So we're going to use this trick, quote unquote trick, but really we're being very strategic with our math, and we're going to be multiplying by a power of 10. We're going to, in this case, multiply by 100. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift the decimal 2 times over to turn that into the number 25. Now, if I do that to the outside, I need to shift it twice on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and add a 0, and now my decimal will live there. So this is exactly the same thing. Our new problem is now 25 divided into, or 250 divided by 25. So my decimal now lives here and now lives at the end of the 25. So now let's go ahead and use our long division. 25 goes into 2 0 times. It goes into 25 once. And it goes into 0 0 times. So my answer is 10. Okay, let's draw a picture of what's happening, because I know this seems really weird, and it's, you're kind of like, what, how, why are we changing our numbers so much? after we get into our fraction unit, I'll be able to explain this a lot better. Really what we're dealing with here are equivalent fractions, and I know it doesn't look like it now, but we are indeed dealing with equivalent fractions. So mathematically, what we're doing is perfectly sound. But for now, let's draw a diagram to understand the meaning of this. So I want to think about the original problem that was 2 5/10 divided by 25 hundredths. So remember, with division, we're trying to figure out how many times the divisor fits into the dividend. So we're going to draw a picture. So the dividend is 2.5. So let's draw one whole thing, two whole things, and then half of a thing. And I'm just going to kind of draw that missing second half, okay? And now we're asking ourselves, so that's 2.5. And I want to know how many times does 25 hundredths or a quarter fit into 2.5? So remember, a quarter, 0 and 25 hundredths, that's 25 cents. That's a quarter. So I'm going to go ahead and split this up into quarters, and I want to see how many quarters fit into this. So I'm going to cut it in half and cut the halves in half. I've just created 4 equal parts. That's a quarter. So this is 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. So that's a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. 4 quarters makes up $1, makes up one whole thing. So I've got 4 more go into my second thing. So this is I'm going to go fraction route, quarter, 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 quarter. And now this is half of a thing, which means only 2 quarters. So if we think about this as like 50 cents, 2 quarters fits into that. So let's see what our answer is. How many of these quarters fit into the 2.5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 sets of 25 hundredths or a quarter fit into the 2.5. So that's a visual model of what's happening. So our meaning of division has not changed at all. Let's do a couple more examples just to really solidify this. So we're going to go ahead and just use the shortcut. So we've got, 8 4/10 divided by 2 hundredths. Okay, so 8 4/10 is my dividend. I'm dividing that by 2 hundredths. Now it's really hard for me to think about how many times does 2 hundredths fit into 8. My brain is not super good with that. So I'm going to go ahead and shift the decimal twice out of there. Now if I shift it twice out of my divisor, 1, 2, I need to shift it twice in my dividend as well. So this now is 840 divided by 2. So let's go ahead and start dividing. 2 goes into 8 4 times. I subtract 8. Bring down the 4, 2 goes into 4 twice, subtract the 4, bring down the 0, that goes in 0 times. This is now where my decimal lives, so it goes straight up, and we'll tack on an extra 0 at the end there. Let's do one more together, and then I'll leave you on your own to do the rest. I've got 21 divided by 2.5. So again, it's not super easy to think about how many times 2.5 fits into 21. Our brains are not super good with that. So we're going to go ahead and use our powers of 10. We're going to multiply by 10, and we're going to shift that decimal one time over. So it's going to live there. So this now is 210 divided by 25. And in the end, my decimal is going to go straight up from its new spot. So 25 goes into 2 0 times, goes into 21 0 times. So now I just got to figure out how many times 25 goes into 200. Well, I do believe 25 times 8 gives me 200, which is really close to my 210. So it goes in 8 times minus 200. I have 10 left over. I'm going to bring down another 0. 25 goes into 100 4 times. So my answer is 8.4. Let's just do 2 more together to really solidify this. So this is 4 86 hundredths divided by 2 tenths. I'm going to go ahead and shift the decimal out of the divisor, which means I'm going to shift it once in my dividend as well. 2 goes into 4 twice. 2 goes into 8 4 times. 2 goes into 6 3 times. I have a remainder of 0, so I'm done. So this is 24 and 3/10. And lastly, I've got 2 and 52 hundredths divided by 7 hundredths. Not so easy to think about how many times 7 hundredths fits into 2. So let's shift our decimal out of there. I shifted it twice. I'm going to shift it twice here, and that's where it will now live. How many times does 7 go into 2? 0 times. 7 goes into 25 3 times. 4 left over. Bring down the 2. 7 goes into 42 6 times. I have 0 left over, and since I have the decimal there, I'll throw a decimal behind. So go ahead and try those last two on your own.